Hello, my name is Bob Tribe, and welcome to Valley to Vietnam. Valley to Vietnam is a joint effort between the Sacramento Public Library and the Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 500. It is our intent to trace the arc of experience between Sacramento and Vietnam for our local Vietnam-era vets. Today, our guest is Brigadier General Jack Hagan. General, welcome. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks for coming. Well, you didn't start out in Sacramento. You were born in New Orleans.
That's correct.
And do you have ancestry that goes back in the South?
Yes, my family's from Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. And I had a direct relative that fought with the Confederate Army.
I figured if you were from the South that happens. And do you have a family history in the military?
Well, not a career history. My father went down to join right after Pearl Harbor, and was declared 4F for an accident he'd had as a kid. A tree fell on his foot.
Okay.
And he kept getting called up for the draft. And the third time he was called up for the draft, he said the physical had degenerated down to counting, lining everybody up, counting feet and dividing by 2. And if you got an even number, everybody to the left went in. And both his brothers served. And then on my mother's side, both of her brothers served. One of them was a career National Guard officer who ended up after World War II staying and retiring as a colonel. Then I had another uncle that was by marriage in the Marines.
You were the first Marine?
I was the first Marine in my family.
Right, okay. You lived in New Orleans till you were ready to go to college. What was it like living in New Orleans?
It was pretty interesting, and right there at the very verge of the beginning of Vietnam, I graduated in 1967, so we had landed in 1965, and things were starting to heat up. And if you didn't go to college, you were pretty much drafted immediately.
Right.
You went 1A the day you graduated.
So you ended up going to the Citadel.
The Citadel is a military college in South Carolina.
Okay.
It's a state-supported school. And you have to take ROTC, either Army or Air Force, and live under the military, live in the barracks, wear a uniform all 4 years. But at the end, you don't have to take a commission or go into service.
Oh, okay.
And you pay in-state or out-of-state rates or get a scholarship to go to school.
Okay. Now, so could you go in any branch of the service coming out of the Citadel?
Yes, you could.
Okay.
You still had to take Army and Air Force ROTC because we didn't have Navy ROTC until my senior year.
Okay.
So I took Army ROTC, and I had already signed up for the platoon leaders class, which was a vehicle to get into the Marine Corps as an officer candidate, before I even left to go to the Citadel.
Oh, so then when you left the Citadel, you had to go through Marine OCS, Officer Candidate School.
Well, PLCs were set up that you went 2 summers, one between your freshman and sophomore year, and then one between your junior and your senior year.
Okay.
And I didn't go the first session because I didn't have my grades up high enough, so I ended up going to the second session, in which was called combined. So we went to a 10-week session, which turns out to be the same thing as OCS, had I graduated and then had to go in, which several of my classmates did.
I know anybody who's had any kind of military school training goes into the service and has a big jump over their classmates who don't have that. Was that the case with you? Did you feel you were?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Except it also sometimes can work to your detriment. My platoon commander, after the second day at OCS, thought that I had a bad attitude, and I just tried to tell him that you know, there wasn't anything they could do to me that hadn't been done already, and I was just here to learn. And so he turned me over to the platoon sergeant, who turned me into the house mouse because I knew what to do.
Right. Now, was what we see when we see people going through West Point or any of the academies, is the Citadel just as rigorous as far as discipline and all that?
Well, we'd like to think it's more rigorous. Both my sons went to the Naval Academy, and when they would ask me what class I am from the Naval Academy, I would tell them I didn't go there. I went to the Citadel, and there was always like, ooh, wow, that's a tough place.
You go to training, first of all, this platoon leader training, and then you have to go through Marine Basic, or what? Yes,
everybody. Once you graduate from OCS, then you go to what's called the Basic School at Quantico, Virginia. Unlike the Army, where you go to your branch-specific basic officer training,
right,
ours is all together. So everybody goes, pilots, infantry, everybody. In fact, you don't even get your MOS, your branch of what you're going to do in the Marine Corps until you graduate from the basic school.
And everybody gets the same type of training in the basic school.
Everybody.
After completing all the training at Quantico, then you're sent to Okinawa, correct?
That's right. I was assigned to 3rd Marine Division, and 3rd Marine Division was still pulling out of Vietnam, so we went into Okinawa, and we were assigned a battalion.
That was 1972?
1972.
Okay.
March of 1972.
So at Okinawa, what were you doing there?
Well, I was assigned 1st Platoon Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, and started, just trying to figure out how to be a platoon commander.
Now, so you're at Okinawa for a few months, and then you're going to go to Vietnam.
Yes, I was there 2 months, and we boarded ships and sailed to Vietnam, and we became what's known as a battalion landing team. So we were BLT 14.
Is this still 72 or is it 73?
72.
Okay. And essentially, you're sort of a quick reaction force then.
Well, the Marine Amphibious Unit, as it was called in those days, the MAU, was also designated as the Special Landing Force. So our mission was to steam up and down the coast of South and North Vietnam to conduct whatever missions were assigned to us by Commander of 7th Fleet, which would have been asked by the ground guys in country in Vietnam.
And essentially, American participation in the war is winding down rapidly at this point.
Very rapidly. The last Army ground unit is about to pull out one of the battalions of the 199th Light Infantry.
Okay. And are the Marines pulling out of I Corps then at the same time?
Well, all the ground units were pretty much out.
Okay.
We still had a VMO, which is an aerial observer squadron, flying out of Da Nang. We had advisors with the South Vietnamese Marines. The only people that were left in country by this time was an aerial observer squadron, VMO 6, and advisors to the South Vietnamese Marines. And they were kind of scattered all over the country.
Right.
We had some advisors over with the South Korean Marines, and we had bits and pieces of people here, there, and everywhere, but no ground forces, no artillery, no infantry, like that.
When you leave there, Vietnam, where do you go next?
Well, we were there for 6 months, and then we sailed back to Okinawa, and we got off our ships. We stayed in Okinawa for a couple of months. Then we went to Camp Fuji in Japan in December. So that was kind of a very abrupt change in weather.
I'll bet.
And then we came back just before Christmas, and right after New Year's, I got transferred to 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, and got back on a ship and went as a replacement draft down to the Philippines, and we joined 1-9 there, and then we sailed back to Vietnam for 2 months.
Okay. You eventually end up in places all over the world because you were in the Marine Corps for, what, near 30 years.
That's correct.
And I noticed in looking at your resume that you were in Kuwait and Somalia. What was going on there? Or what was your participation anyway?
Well, Kuwait was Desert Storm.
Okay.
I was assigned to 2nd Battalion, 24th Marines, which was a reserve battalion out of Chicago. Had units in Chicago, Waukegan, Illinois, Milwaukee, Madison, Wisconsin, and Des Moines, Iowa. And 224 was part of 4th Marine Division, which was the reserve division. But they had a very famous history. They landed on Iwo Jima, and one of the guys in Golf Company 224 won the Medal of Honor, Captain Joseph J. McCarthy. So we had a pretty rich history.
Okay.
So now it's 1990, 91, and Desert Storm's happening, and we mobilized the battalion, activated them, and shipped them overseas. I didn't go with them. I got right to the staging area, and then I had to go back to Chicago. And when as soon as they came back, I got transferred to the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, Special Operations Capable, and sent back to Kuwait as another landing force as the war was over. Well, it only lasted 100 hours.
Right.
And then we were the post-war force in place over there for about 6 months. And then on our way out, we ran down to Somalia and landed a couple of guys just to arrange meetings clandestinely to fly in the first group of peacekeepers, which was a Pakistani battalion. And every day we would fly Air Force control team that would go into the old international airport and land a couple of C-141s loaded up with Pakistani troops. And that was in September of 1991, and we landed 91 or 92, I can't remember now. But the war was over. It was the next year. We landed in Somalia with Task Force Restore Hope in December. And I'd been there in September, and in December I went back as the naval liaison to the commander of the Task Force Restore Hope. I went out and sat on the flagship with the admiral. I was his connection between the commander on the ground and the commander of the naval forces. So I was a direct link between the two.
Good duty.
It was very interesting duty. Very interesting duty.
Special operations forces in the Marine Corps, what essentially does that entail?
Well, the raid, the long history of this is the raid from Desert One, the failed Iranian hostage raid where we tried to get the hostages out.
Right.
And we had pickup teams of helicopter crews with all services, and it just turned into a real debacle. And the result of that was the stand-up of U.S. Special Operations Command, which encompassed the Delta Force, Army Rangers, Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, the Army's Special Operations Squadron, the 160th, and some Air Force Special Ops squadrons. The Marine Corps was not invited to play, so we had what we call Special Operations Capable Units to split hairs with the Defense Department's vernacular. but we had a maritime special purpose force, which was built around a platoon from the Force Reconnaissance Company. So they could, we had 12 missions, but they could do clandestine surveillance and reconnaissance, direct action missions, hostage rescue. That's what we were really trained mostly for, was hostage rescue. Direct action missions in which we could capture prisoners, take out high-key military targets, blow up stuff.
So you just throw in a modifier with capable, kind of an adjective, and then you can do anything that they can do.
Exactly.
Oh, that's...
And U.S. SOCOM finally figured out, and so did Joint Special Operations Command, that, geez, we're in Fort Bragg, and you guys are on ships over the horizon right there where it's going on.
Yeah.
And so it'll take us at least 2, maybe 3 days to get there at the best, just because flying time from one side of the world to the other, and you guys are already there. So if we asked you to go in country, you could get eyes on target before we get there. And if looks like it's going to go south on us, you guys are ready to take the target down before we can get there.
So you're finally invited to the party, so to speak.
Well, kind of, as but we had to come in the back door. We weren't allowed in the front door.
Right.
So that Marine Expeditionary Unit that I was with in Somalia had a maritime special purpose force on it, and I was the operations officer. So I wasn't the on-scene commander, but I was the commander as the ops officer for what they did. And we had a training package that was 6 months long before we deployed, and that's how I came up here to Sacramento for the first time, was when we did training up here.
Okay.
Because we did a thing called training in an urban environment, things that we couldn't duplicate on the base.
Mm-hmm.
From my job with 11th MEU SOC, I went over to the Special Operations Training Group, and now was the officer in charge of the guys that were training. So I came up here to Sacramento like once every 6 months because we could bed the helicopters still down at McClellan, because McClellan was still open.
Right. So you come to Sacramento in 1999 as you retire out of the Marine Corps.
Right.
After 30 years.
After 30 years. Well, I went to work for the Department of Justice as a special agent here in Sacramento at the field office in Rancho Cordova.
Oh.
I ran into an Army officer who was serving with the National Guard, as he was a retired regular Army officer. And he said there was this thing called the California State Military Reserve, and that I should look into it because they were looking for somebody to start the California Naval Militia. And so I went over to the National Guard headquarters and talked to them and signed up, and then immediately got put on state active duty to run the state's Homeland Security Training and Exercise Program.
Oh.
So I stayed on state active duty for 6 years. I was appointed as the commanding general of the State Military Reserve.
And you did that till?
January 2009, 3 years.
You have 5 children.
That's right.
And some of them, I understand, are in the military, or were.
I had three daughters and 2 sons. Both the boys went to the Naval Academy. They both graduated from Paso Robles High School.
Okay.
So they both went to the Naval Academy, and they both went in the Marine Corps. One was a helicopter pilot, flying CH-46s, and the other one was a infantry officer. In fact, he was assigned to 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, which I had been the XO and CO of back in the 80s.
The girls didn't join the service?
No, none of the girls joined the service.
Okay, because that happens with certain regularity.
Oh,
today.
I know. I was in hopes they would, but none of the 3 wanted to. So.
I just wanted to kind of summarize here. What are your thoughts about Vietnam today, now that you've had time to look at it from a distant perspective?
It was the wrong war.
Right.
You know, there were so many missteps, it's not even funny. I mean, they write books about this stuff, so it's pretty hard to.
Sure. You and I have read most of them.
Yeah, summarize what happens in a few minutes. But we did the classic of try to fight today's war using last war's tactics. We didn't understand counterinsurgency. We didn't understand guerrilla warfare. I say we, I'm talking about the Defense Department.
Right.
The Army wanted to fight the whole war based on search and destroy missions. The Marine Corps wanted to win the hearts and minds. It wasn't until almost to the end of the war that Army picked up on a program we were using called a Combined Action Group, CAG, in which we put a platoon of Marines in the village, and they stayed there with a platoon of South Vietnamese soldiers or popular force, kind of like militia, National Guard guys.
RFPFs.
PFs, yes. And they provided security for the village, kept the NVA from coming in, kept the Viet Cong from raiding the village, taking their food, killing the mayor, that kind of stuff.
Right.
It was very, very successful.
You know, the Army Special Forces was essentially doing that with the Mountain Yards.
That's right.
And the Mountain Yards were kind of the minority people of Vietnam and looked down upon by most of the Vietnamese people. But that was very successful, and they just moved their whole families into these camps.
That's exactly what we did.
Yeah.
And we learned how to do that in Nicaragua and Haiti, in Santo Domingo in the 20s. We wrote a book on it called The Small Wars. In fact, the Army, General Petraeus had it republished because we're doing the same thing again in Afghanistan. Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel in the Army that made the decision in the very beginning of Vietnam that we would do individual rotations. People would serve a year, then they'd rotate back.
And not go over as units.
Well, the first ones went over as units because I had to get there.
First Cav.
Like the first Cav. The Marical Division went over as a unit. But after the first year, people started rotating in and out, and that caused more problems. That caused more casualties than anything else in the Vietnamese War, was that personnel decision, because half your men were leaving and half your men were coming, and there was no unit cohesion. Officers didn't stay long enough to learn what they were doing, and the casualty rate just based on that was far more significant than the casualty rates of Korea and World War II, when cohesive units who had trained together went in and fought together.
You know, that's a really good point, General. I know I've talked to so many men, and they said, because there was just this constant rotation, you stayed away from all the newbies.
Oh, yeah.
They were the people that might get you killed. So I know guys who were trained on M14s, got there, they handed them an M16, and nobody taught them anything. Nobody showed them how to use the weapon, how to clean the weapon, how to tear it apart. And you had to prove yourself that you were going to do the right thing in battle, and maybe you just had that in you or you didn't. And if you didn't, nobody was going to help you, and you're probably going to be dead. Otherwise, that key thing of saying that you have to train together and work together as a group is so important. And that happens if you spend any time together, say just even a replacement sort of thing, but it didn't work that way too much.
Well, and especially because you'd have a bunch of seasoned NCOs or junior enlisted men, and then all of a sudden you get a brand new second lieutenant.
Yeah.
Oh, this guy's going to get us killed.
Right.
I mean, I had the same problem when I was a platoon commander, because I walked into a platoon that was already existing. And fortunately, we had about a month or two to train up before we left, and then a couple of months of training before we would have on board ship and in the training areas in the Philippines before we'd have landed in Vietnam. So I had an opportunity to have some unit cohesion with my folks before the first firefight.
Right. I think the smart second lieutenants are the ones that realize how little they know. They don't try to act like they're in charge. They hook up with their NCOs and just learn as much as they can. Let them call in the artillery and let them call in the airstrikes initially, and then learn by that process.
Well, that was the thing they taught us in OCS, was listen to your NCOs.
I always did.
And I listened to mine, and but I found there was a point where I would listen to them, and then I'd go, okay, because that's not exactly the way I was taught, and I'd say, so how many tours in Vietnam did you have? Oh, this was my second one. Oh, what'd you do the first one? Oh, I was a PFC, and so you just followed the guy in front of you. Right. You weren't a squad leader or a sergeant.
Sure.
So they had the guys on second and third tours had, a limited amount of experience, just based on the fact that they didn't do much. And now they come back as a squad leader or a platoon sergeant. Their experience isn't it's as a PFC, a rifleman, walking along in the last fire team.
And that especially happened when they started the instant NCO sort of schools. So
well, that was the Army. We didn't have instant NCO schools.
We had that, and that was happening when I was in. Well, General Jack Hagan, I'd like to thank you for coming in today and say thank you for your service.
You're quite welcome,
Thank you
sir.
for 36 years of service. I appreciate it, and anybody who would know you would too. So that concludes our time on Valley to Vietnam. I'd like to thank General Hagan once again and say welcome home to him and all our vets. For Valley to Vietnam producer Jerry Ward and director James Scott, I'm Bob Tribe, saying farewell, and we'll see you next time.